John, welcome to Creator Talks. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Oh, my pleasure.
The reason we're here today is I want to talk about things that are your passion, things you love, related to your movies and to the comics that you've done and the books you've written around comic book characters and around monsters, and one of your great loves, Frankenstein monster. Like, that is the monster for you.
I've been a Frankenstein fan since probably I was 5 or 6 years old. I was my mother and I and my grandmother were at a movie theater in Chicago called the Music Box, which is where I had a premiere of one of my movies some years ago, but that's another story. But I was about, I don't know, just a kid, and it was a Boris Karloff, it was a Western kind of, it was a movie called Tap Roots where he played a Native American, okay? And my mother said, that's the actor who played Frankenstein. I'd never heard that word before. And then on the way home, we walked to the theater. On the way home, back home, I said, who's Frankenstein? And she said, well, it was a dead man that was brought back to life. And that just resonated with me. And then over the years, I learned more and more about who the character was, and I finally saw some of the movies, and it's just been a major love for me ever since then.
What was your favorite Frankenstein movie? Which one captured it the best? Was it the first one, Bride? What do you think?
Well, I used to say Bride, but now I'm taking like maybe the first three collectively, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and Son of Frankenstein. But I also love all the others, the B movies that were made in the 40s, for different reasons. They were fun. And the first movies I ever saw, Frankenstein movies I ever saw in the theater, were House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. So they had a huge impact on me, and they affected my storytelling up to this day. And I mean, they were, I think, more made for kids than adults, like the first three were, but they just had that whole atmosphere, with the villagers and all that, the mist and the smoke and the castles and all that coming together, just profoundly affected me. That was like an epiphany for me, seeing those two movies.
They're great movies, and I remember looking for those on television before we had DVRs and VCRs, and I'd have to look through the TV guide for those. When are they going to be on? And eventually, when they started coming out on VHS tape, I went to the VHS store and bought all of those Universal horror films, all the Frankenstein ones, and I love those things. And a lot of people have played Frankenstein, of course, Boris Karloff being one of the first and best for Universal. And then we had Lon Chaney Jr., Bela Lugosi even played, and then Glenn Strange played in the House of Frankenstein,
Yeah.
House of Dracula, and you actually had Glenn in one of your films later.
Yeah, I made an amateur movie called The Adventures of the Spirit with Bob Burns, and I talked Glenn Strange. I didn't really talk him into it. I just asked him if he would do it, and he said he would, and that was a big thrill for me. And there's one scene where he strangles me, and his hands were so big they almost wrapped around my entire neck, with the fingertips meeting on the other side. He was a great guy, though. He really was. But, I saw all of them except the Karloffs, the three Karloffs, in theaters when they were re-released by Real Art.
Okay.
So, but in those days, what was fun, actually, before Famous Monsters of Filmland and all these magazines, my friends and I that went to see these movies, we didn't know what order they came in, when they were made. I didn't know who Glenn Strange was until later. And we would try to figure out what the sequence was by the ending of one and the beginning of the other. And that was fun, It was like a project, and we finally figured it out.
That's part of my love of those movies, is that they all kind of have some connection together. Maybe
Yeah.
not always very smooth, but they are part of a collection. And I'm always so into anything like that that's a series, whether it be a television, long-running series, or films. I love that. And one of the films I liked, one of the best Universal monster movies ever, I think, and definitely the best Abbott and Costello, was Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I love it. My kids love it. I mention it all the time on the show. And Glenn Strange was the Frankenstein monster in that movie.
Yeah, and there's only one real problem with that movie today. Because I'm in the film business, I talk to a lot of actors, and I do sometimes seminar speeches, telling actors how to get work and how to network, all this sort of thing. And almost nobody knows who Abbott Costello is anymore. So it's like, who meets Frankenstein. They know who Frankenstein is, but they don't know who Laurel and Hardy is. They don't know who James Stewart is. They don't know who Stanley Kubrick is. These are supposed to be working actors, you know. They don't know who Humphrey Bogart is. Clark Gable, they don't know who it is. But so that's, I think, the only problem might be the title, because eventually nobody's going to remember who that, who you know, who they are. I mean, the film buffs do, but I'm
Right.
just a guy, the people on the street.
It's sad because in school we have to learn about history, world history, American history. It's part of the curriculum. And I think especially for actors, they should know about these great actors and great films. And I mean, you can't just say, well, that was before my time, so I don't really know that. I think it's important to know. I mean, I really love going back and watching those old movies.
Oh, so do I.
It drives my wife crazy because she's a little younger than me, so she doesn't know a lot of this stuff, and I'll be making references to things that she doesn't get. Her parents find them funny, but she doesn't understand it. But I was like, no, this is a great movie. Like, I'm watching this movie, and the guy says, we don't need no stinking badges. And I said, I saw that in Blazing Saddles, but now I'm watching it in Sierra Madre or whatever it was, and I'm like, my mind's blown because I just love seeing those connections and going back to the source, you know?
Yeah, without going into any details that might get me into legal trouble, I was doing a deposition once, and they had a video of me talking about what the case was about, and in the deposition on the video, I said, "I'm shocked." The lawyer said, "What do you mean by that? What were you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I was doing Claude Rains from Casablanca." And you know when he comes in there and he sees gambling going on?
Yes.
And he looked at me like it was just stunned.
I didn't know what you meant.
He wasn't ready for an answer like that. Yeah.
Why do you think Frankenstein's monster, has endured for 200 years? Why is it still, I mean, because today now it's like, you can blow something up with a bomb, you can shoot with a machine gun, so it's just a monster, not like the bigger threats we have today since the atomic age. But why is it still something that people, fans of horror, still love so much?
Well, the book, which is last year had its 200th anniversary of the first printing, first publication, that's never been out of print, ever. It's been, I mean, there's multiple editions of it out all the time. And, you know, it's a hard book to read now because it's written in a very old-fashioned style, but there's some real basic truths in that book. A father and son relationship, when Victor rejects basically his son, and that's a very powerful thing. So, you know, most people have never read the book. They're just familiar with the movies. But then the movies and the plays and the comic books and everything, there's something appealing about that, the way that he's interpreted now with the Jack Pierce makeup, and there's something really compelling about that. And I don't know exactly what it is, and a lot of it had to do originally with Boris Karloff's performance. But even now, you make a Frankenstein movie, people respond to it, and they always say people identify with the monster, you know, because when they're teenagers, they go through an awkward period, and you know they're clumsy and all this, and people reject him and all this. I was interviewed by the BBC some years ago. They were doing a special on Frankenstein, and they wanted me to articulate about why I identified with the monster, like everybody else. And I was thinking, and I was fishing, and I was coming up with all the stock answers that everybody gives, all the cliche answers. And I said, wait a minute. I don't know if I ever identified with the monster. I identified with Victor because he actually did things. He actually created things. You know, that's my whole life is based on creating things, you know, stories and music and whatever. And that wasn't the answer they wanted me to give, but that was the answer I gave them. And I think that's true. I think I identified with Victor Frankenstein more than a monster.
I see that in your movies because that is the central character, is the creator, the either Frankenstein or one of his descendants. So let's talk about some of your Frankenstein films.
Well, I only made one professionally, and that was the new one, Tales of Frankenstein, that came out just at the end of, just for Halloween, 2018. What I wanted that film to do was come out on the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. First, I mean, you know, the commercial reason, because I figured there was going to be a lot of Frankenstein things coming out, books and who knows what, to capitalize on that. and and I could use that in selling the movie. And the other thing was, it was like a tribute to Mary Shelley's book, and I wanted to be part of that celebration. And that's why it came out in 2018.
And the Blu-ray just came out October 1st of
Right,
2019.
right. And the DVD came out right before Halloween, which is another, me thinking commercial terms,
Good timing.
because everybody wants horror films for Halloween. And if they miss that, they make nice stocking stuffers for Christmas.
Right. And if people haven't heard of it, well, it's a modest budget horror, almost comedy horror film. And I love that so much because today there is, and I love this too, in a way, the CGI and everything they use in movies for the superhero movies, it's great because they can do things they couldn't do before. But when it comes to horror, I just don't want a whole bunch of CGI. I just want a good story that really pulls me in and good
I
character.
love the Universal movies and I love the Hammer films. And I wanted to do something old school, something like that. I wanted to have things that you should have in a Frankenstein movie, like villages with torches and brain transplants and, um, weird scientists and that sort of thing. And that's what I did. But I did it. I wanted to have practical effects, practical makeup effects. I didn't want to put a lot of it's expensive anyway to have CGI, and I don't particularly like CGI. To me, it's taken over the movies. You look at one of these Marvel movies or DC superhero movies, and the whole last act is nothing but CGI effects. It's like a cartoon, a high-tech cartoon. And I wanted to do something more traditional with real actors, real makeups, and real stories. There's 4 stories in there, and I couldn't make them longer than they were. They were longer originally. We had to cut them down because the movie was going to run too long. Um, I wanted them to be real stories, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and not just a lot of pizzazz.
And these 4 stories took place at different times. It progressively gets closer
Yeah,
to the
yeah. Each
current.
story takes place in a different country in a different time period, which presented some challenges because we had to have all the right clothes and the one that's set in the 40s, we had to have the right telephone, we had to have the right car, we, even the lightning. I wanted to get that stock lightning shot you see in all those old movies, including Bride of Frankenstein. And it took me a while to find it, but I got it. And I wanted to make sure all the sound effects were like from 1940s radio shows. We got all those. And if the detective in that episode made a reference to a Frankenstein movie, it had to be the Abbott and Costello one because the segment took place in 1948. And when he mentions the Three Stooges, it's got to be Shemp
That's
because
right.
Shemp, all those
That's
little
right.
things had to be right. And I was very, very fussy about that.
I just watched that this week and I rented it. And my son wanted to see it. And my wife's like, you got to go to bed. We're strict about that. But I was like, yeah, he's watching the movie. Come on. So next day he's like, can we watch it? I'm like, I rented it. I'll get it again. Or maybe I'll have to get the Blu-ray now. But he likes that kind of stuff. He loves that.
I didn't want to make them like so many horror films are today. I didn't want to make a horror film that left you with a bad taste in your mouth, that they got you depressed, that
Mm.
made you sick. I wanted it to be a fun monster movie, the kind we grew up on, pretty
Mm.
much. I mean, it's got color and it's got, some uh, updates of, style or whatever. But each one was done in the style of that a certain era. Most people don't realize it, but the second story, the one with the crawling hand, is my homage to Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe movies, and almost nobody picks up on that. It's got the dream sequences and even the character's name Vincent. The alchemist in that. Uh, his wife's name is Lenore. And there's cutaways to black cats and ravens. There's a burial alive sequence and a telltale heart. Nobody picks
Hmm.
up on that for some reason, or they don't mention it. Um, but anyway, I tried to be very consistent. And the first one and the last one more. The first one they were both kind of like combinations of Universal and Hammer films.
Hmm. Tell me about some of the actors in that film because there are some connections with horror actors like John Blythe Barrymore from the Barrymore
It's
family.
a low budget B movie, let's face it, that's what it is. But I didn't want it to look like one. And one problem with B movies, low budget movies, everybody uses the same B actors, the same scream queens, the same, out of work you know, male actors that haven't worked in a long time, but they can get them cheap. And that puts a stigma on your movie right away. When you go to the American film market or some way to sell it, and they see all these people that do all these kinds of movies over and over again, that can kill your movie. So I wanted to make sure I'd use none of them. And so I, John Blythe Barrymore, and what a great guy he was to work with. You know, he never even, he had the script on his cell phone. He never even printed it out. And he said, "What scene are we doing now?" And I said, "Oh, we're doing, you know, whatever." And he would look at the cell phone, and he would nail it. He would get every single word. And then he did scenes with Jerry Lacey from Dark Shadows and Play It Again, Sam. The two of those guys working together, it was like magic. And we even left some of Jerry's cuts a little bit longer because he would do something, you know, with his eyes or his eye, and it was just wonderful to see that. Then we have Ann Robinson, who was in War of the Worlds, the original War of the Worlds, and a lot of other movies. We have Beverly Washburn, who lives right here in Las Vegas, um, who started her career doing things like Superman and the Mole Man back in 1951, but she was in Spider Baby, The Lone Ranger, Old Yeller. I mean, she has an incredible resume. Star Trek. We have T.J. Storm, who, besides being a great actor and a wonderful person to have on set, was Godzilla. In the last two Godzilla movies, he was the motion capture guy doing all of Godzilla stuff. He was in the Deadpool movies, the X-Man, the guy
Oh,
who,
Colossus?
yes,
Hmm.
that was him.
Okay.
And Mel Novak, who did all those Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris martial arts movies. He did a movie with Christopher Lee. Um,
Wow.
what was that? It was a Chuck Norris movie, and Christopher Lee was the villain in it, and I think he was like Mel was like a henchman. So I have some really good actors in this. Some of them you probably wouldn't be familiar with, but those would be some of the name actors. And I was very careful. And the people that didn't have like a long resume, we brought them in for some, you know, to audition.
Okay.
And some of the auditions weren't easy. But they had to look like, you know, one thing when I cast a movie, the actor has to look like the character. And, you know, I see too many movies and too many plays where the actor just bears no resemblance to the character they're playing, at least in my mind. You know, a guy playing a leading man and he looks like Woody Allen, you know, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And,
It's hard to sell it
yeah,
that
or
way.
the actress playing the young babe is, you know, like 45 years old and much, you know, very overweight. It doesn't work. You got to look like the character. And luckily I had wonderful actors who were wonderful to deal with. They had great, you know, attitudes and personalities, and there were no prima donnas on this movie.
And you even had a comic book writer creator in the film as well.
Oh yeah, that was sad. Len Wein,
Yeah.
who went through a lot of grief, you know, because he was Len has never been in good health. He's had serious health problems since he was a kid. He never told anybody. He was this really outgoing kind of guy, and everybody loved Len. And he was going through a lot of pain. And I said, "Len, are you sure you want to do this movie?" And he said, "Yeah, I want to do it." And he came on the set. He had to come in like around 9 in the morning, 10 in the morning, because the first scenes we shot with him for all kinds of logistical reasons, he had the makeup where he's got the plague, you know. And then the other scenes were shot at night. So there was a period of about 6 or 7 hours in between that he just laid there on a bed. And I said, "Len,
Oh.
I'll replace you. I'll get somebody else." And he said, "No, we've been friends since the early 1970s. I don't want to disappoint you. And I want to do this movie." And he did it. But unfortunately, he passed away before it was finished, so he never got to see it.
Well, it's a great tribute to have him in it.
Yeah, and
And
we dedicated the movie to him.
yes.
And now, since then, Robert Axelrod also passed away. He was one of the villagers, and he was also one of the Power Rangers, one of the voices of the original Power Rangers.
Okay.
Played one of the villains in there or something. And so he was in the hospital when we had the premiere, so he never got to see it either.
Now you plan on doing another movie like that, like a sequel, follow-up to that?
I had a vampire movie I wanted to do, which was kind of a combination of Carmilla and Death Wish, you know, but
Hmm.
a very urban kind of thing with a. I don't want to get into the plot, but we're getting such good reviews and response on the Frankenstein movie, and I have more stories to use. I said we should just do another Frankenstein movie. So I have a script. It's called Tales of Frankenstein Book Two, and I say Book Two instead of the sequel or something because the stories are all based on published short stories of mine that came out in a book called Tales of Frankenstein.
Yes.
And I have the script already written, uh, in my mind, even partially cast. But you know, I got to make some money off the first one before I can make another one.
Right. It is so hard to get some of these ideas through Hollywood because there's certain expectations on revenue and everything. I mean, it's a business, but there's something that these indie films, these mid-budget films bring to us, a certain joy, a certain happiness of seeing these great stories brought to the screen with a lot of passion and love behind them.
You hit it right on the head because they're not corporate movies. They're not made by a company or a bunch of 25-year-old guys sitting behind it. He's sitting at a table who have never heard of Humphrey Bogart before, but they're going to make a movie, and it's all going to be special effects, and it's going to bring in. It's going to cost millions of dollars and bring in billions of dollars. Um, it's a separate industry, really, and they're made by people. Some of them, not all of them. Some of them are made by people with a lot of love for the genre and a love for making movies and with passion. I like to think of myself as one of those people. I mean, if Tales of Frankenstein doesn't make a dime, the experience of making that movie was so great that you know if it makes its money back, that's wonderful. I can make another movie, then that's where the money would go. But there's no cynicism involved. At least with some of us, just some independent movie makers, B movie makers, just know they're going to be making a piece of junk, and they go into it with that attitude.
Mhm.
And you know, we just get a bunch of girls to take their tops off, and we're going to make them a lot of money. I don't do that. Maybe I did years ago, but I don't anymore.
Tell me about how much time goes into making one of these films, because you do have, I mean, I did think that the shots were very good, the quality was very
Mm.
good, the acting was very good, and I don't want to spoil anything because they're all like surprise endings, but I do have to say, and I won't spoil it, but the last story in there, um, that last scene, I was like, my son didn't see it, and I was like, he's got to see this.
One of the main problems I see in low budget movies and people who aren't familiar with, you know, the people making those movies uh, don't know what really separates them from the the real movies as we call them. One is they put in too much dialogue. They tell you too much. They don't leave
Mhm.
enough up to your imagination. In other words, I call them "there they go" lines. A car drives away. Somebody will say, "There they go."
Duh.
Well, you know they're going. Well, you show
You
that. You know,
showed it,
you
right?
don't have to say that. Look at how many movies with like a Clint Eastwood movie. How much he says without saying anything. You know, and that's what I try to do. Now, in that one you're talking about,
Hmm.
I could have just said, had the scientist at the end say, "Oh my God, what have I done? I have," and
Right,
then
right.
explained it.
Yeah.
But I don't say that. In fact, I, I'm almost worried. Maybe I should have put more information. There's all little hints of what's going on.
Hmm.
Things hanging up on walls, and you know the talking about the soil that preserves. You know, all those sort of things. You put those all together, it is all very clear, and it all is solidified in the shot when he looks in the mirror at the
I
end.
love that shot. Oh my God, that was so good.
That
I
was
didn't expect that. That's the thing about the way it looked.
everybody on the set told me it was not going to work. And I said, it's going to work. We're
Yeah.
just going to use some simple practical effects, some of which I use in my old amateur movies when I was a kid. And I said, it's going to work. And they all looked at me like, and it worked.
See, the thing is, it
I mean,
respects.
you got it. You understood what that meant.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And
Okay.
that's the thing, it respects the audience intelligence. You don't have to spoon feed
Mm.
them. If you pay attention and you love that kind of film, you're going to pick up on it and you're going to enjoy it all the more because someone's not saying, well, here's what happened, or you have the sidekick or whatever explaining things to the audience because they don't get it. Like, sometimes I find that a little bit like, duh. And I'm telling you, get it. People have to get this and see it. It's really, really good. I look forward to seeing more of that. Now, today, it's very easy to shoot videos, case in point, and the technology's there, which is a wonderful thing, but you just can't point and shoot and there you go. I got something now, because a lot of people are creating content. But there's things that they have to learn to make good content. It's not always about the money, how much you're spending to make it. You could always throw money at stuff, like we talk about big budget films and try to make things, eye candy and great special effects, but there's more to it to make it something compelling, interesting, and have staying power 10, 20 years from now. To those who are out there trying to make their own content, videos, whatever, what do you think they need to learn to make good content, to make stuff that will actually stick with people and stand the test of time?
You should have a good story, and a lot of people don't, and good actors. That's another thing. Don't just hire. I mean, I made this mistake years ago, just putting people in because they were friends of mine, but then they couldn't act, and or you get these, girls that'll take their top off in a movie, but they can't act, So make sure you have good actors, and make sure you know something about the language of films, the visual language. When do you do a zoom in? When do you do a pan shot? All these kinds of things. And I kind of learned it as I went along. I went to film school, but I learned most of it just doing it, and making sure that you're not breaking the crossing the line, as they say. So you get a jump cut or something. And see, I can see the movie in my head before I ever even write the script sometimes. So I can see how things are going to edit together, and what we're going to need is a cutaway, and what we're going to need is um, to get from one scene to the next scene. I've known directors that sit down and they diagram everything, and they have arrows pointing at this, and I don't do any of that. I don't really plan, because I found out the hard way. You can plan and plan, and you can have your cinematographer with you on the set. You can figure the day before, and you're figuring out all the angles and everything. When you get on the set, everything is different. Props haven't shown up. There's something in the way, you can't move, whatever. So I wait until I'm on the set the first, when everybody else is setting up and the food is coming in. That's when I figure out what I'm going to shoot. And it all seems to work out.
Had a great time.